For more perspective on China and India's ties, I'm joined now live from Boston by Ravi Ramamurti. He's a distinguished professor of international business and strategy and the director of the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. Ravi, thanks for joining us. I want to first start with the China-US trade war. I want to ask you, is India benefiting from it, or if not, could it benefit from it, and how?
Well, I mean, both India and China have an issue with the US with respect to trade. Of course, the problem is much more serious from China's perspective because of the volumes of trade China has with the US are much more than what India has with the US. So the one issue on which I think both countries can agree is that they stand against the US approach of being protectionist, and they also don't approve of the US approach of being unilateral. So trying to go back to a world that is more multilateral and more open is something that both countries can agree on, and they can help each other to promote that perspective. The other possibility is that because of the tensions between the US and China, that China will be more inclined to cultivate the relationship with India, and also India is potentially a very large market for China. And your introduction referred to the trade imbalance between the two countries in China's favor. China may be more inclined to try to bring down that deficit, make the Chinese market more accessible to Indian suppliers, for instance, by buying products from India rather than from the US. And that could be to India's benefit.
Last week, India's central bank cut rates to a 9-year low to try to reignite domestic growth. What's behind that slowdown in India?
Well, I think we're seeing a global slowdown in many of the countries of the world. So there is a bit of that feedback, and India is not exempt from it, although India is not as trade dependent as some other countries, even less so than China. But I think India has a tremendous need for structural reforms to reignite growth. And for a number of years, India has been cruising along on the back of reforms made in earlier years. And people feel that it's time that the Indian government, now that it has a new mandate and another 5-year term, should embark on some bolder reforms to free up the economy, to free up labor markets, for instance, and really find ways to create a lot more jobs that can fuel the consumption demand and get incomes rising for the common person.
I want to talk to you a little bit about S. Jaishankar's trip, the Indian foreign minister we know in China, laying the groundwork for President Xi Jinping's visit to India in October. We know that the foreign minister was an ambassador in China. He understands how Beijing works. But how significant do you think this visit is, these meetings are, and what are the top issues being discussed?
Well, I think the immediate issue that came up, I think, was the Kashmir policy issue. But, you know, India and China are both very important economies, and they have many things on which they disagree and many things on which they agree. And I think the purpose of these kinds of conversations is to increase the areas of agreement and not let the areas of disagreement become major stumbling blocks towards a harmonious relationship. And the meetings that Prime Minister Modi had with President Xi in Wuhan, which was an informal summit of a kind that had never taken place before, I think has set a precedent of these two leaders meeting periodically without any outstanding major issue that they have to resolve, and just dealing with the relationship and maintaining the relationship just as you would tend to a garden, and to make sure that there are no serious problems in the relationship. So I think by setting this meeting with the Foreign Minister Jaishankar, he creates the foundation for a productive meeting between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi in October.
I want to move away from Kashmir and talk about Huawei. China has warned India of retaliatory sanctions if it prevents the Chinese telecoms firm from doing business in India. That is a possibility, we understand. Is India being influenced by the Trump administration's call to blacklist Huawei, or does it have its own security concerns over the Chinese maker?
I suspect it's probably the pressure from the US to not allow Huawei to become a supplier. But India has, in the past, bought a lot of equipment from Huawei, India has one of the lowest prices for data services in the world and one of the highest usages per capita among smartphone users of data. So all of that is built on the back of inexpensive infrastructure and low-cost Chinese products such as those coming from ZTE or Huawei are an important part of that. So I think there will be a lobby within India that says we want to continue to have access to inexpensive gear. But there's also the pressure coming from the other side. I think they will find some way to meet the needs of both of their important relationships.
Professor Ravi Ramamurti, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.